So, good morning. Welcome to this new episode of the Panel Fit Monthly Chat. Today we have here Łukasz Król. I hope I spelled that right.
Yeah, thank you.
Who is a researcher and lecturer working with the College of Europe in Natolin. So, good morning, Łukasz.
Morning.
Okay, please, we have some background noise, so I'll mute our audience microphone. Sorry to be so brutal, but I have to.
Sorry.
Okay, let's start right away with the first question. As we introduced in on our tweet presenting the show, today we are talking about cybersecurity mainly and on how new technologies impact on civil society, which is a quite broad angle, but we'll go deeper on some small aspects of this topic. So let's start right away. So Łukasz, is it right, according to you, to put the burden of data protection and cybersecurity on users? And what's the ideal trade-off between awareness on the user and accountability of tech providers?
That's a really, really good question, right? So I think that with all decisions that concern our data, our sovereignty, anything about us, the idea of consent is incredibly meaningful. And one of the biggest questions we should be asking is, are we able to consent or are we not able to consent? And this is something that there's an internet sociologist called Zeynep Tufekci. I can write her name down in the chat. And she sort of worked on this and talked about this. But look, if your data is being used, your data is going through so many different places, right? So your data, let's say, is being reused by Facebook. Then it trains Facebook's algorithms. Facebook's algorithms are going to feed into another ad network. Like, because all of this data is feeding into such complicated machine learning models, it's actually impossible for us to really understand how it's going to be used. And because it's impossible for us to understand how it's going to be used, because there is this butterfly effect in which my data could, for example, be used, let's say, in Facebook's ad network, it could be used in Google's ad network, it could then be used to train a machine learning model, and then eventually, I don't know, this machine learning model could figure out how to sell better cars, all based on how I've been scrolling on Facebook. This essentially means that the chain is so incredibly complex, but it's impossible for any user. In fact, it's impossible for sort of the Facebook and Google programmers themselves to understand this chain of causation. And as such, I would say that consent is very much impossible. So actually putting the burden on the user is this weird idea of making the user responsible for something which not even the companies fully know how it works. It's putting them in charge of a chain of consent that they cannot realistically get information about and that they cannot realistically consent to. So I really recommend looking up Zeynep Tufekci about it, but I think that pushing a lot of this stuff on the user can be very difficult. Not only this, but I think that pushing security on the user themselves is a way for organizations to really take a lot of blame away from themselves, especially when it comes to things like data mining and the like. And it's really interesting how it's really interesting. So for example, when you look at banking apps generally don't allow you to store the password in a password manager, even though that's the safest thing. So banks actually recommend against using a more secure behavior. In fact, for some banks, they recommend against the most secure behavior in their contracts, but you sort of, as the user, are obliged to still remember your passwords. It's a very bizarre relationship sometimes as to where responsibility really falls.
Okay. Yeah, and then let's start to mix the order of questions, because what you said drives me to something I would have asked you later. But do you think European Union should work more on security literacy and awareness? Because if we say that I mean, we talk about burden of security on users. It's also about users' awareness of what their of the consequences of their behaviors or of what they don't do. I mean, what do you think?
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think that the first thing that we should really start discussing is actually the idea of responsibility and whose responsibility is security anyway. So what very often will happen is that there is, let's say, so in the US, there was the very, very loud example of the Equifax hack. So Equifax was a credit ratings agency, if I remember correctly. So they have a huge amount of user data, right? And they were essentially broken into. And it was because Equifax had really, really bad security procedures that people's personal data leaked out on such a way. And it was actually the results of like corporate mistakes and corporate wrongdoing that exposed users in such a difficult way. So yes, security education is very, very important. The other thing that I think is very, very important, though, is first of all to give people the confidence to demand better security, to have laws that sort of, force reporting on, for example, security breaches. And I think that the final thing that we need to do is we need to make people feel like the data is theirs and like they are involved in the discussion about it. I think that one of the things that we really often witness is that whenever we talk about a topic that's related to tech or data, it feels like we often feel that technology is left to technologists alone, and that only people who are sort of, machine learning experts can have opinions on Facebook's algorithms. No, like technology is our social infrastructure. It's our democratic infrastructure. Technology is far, far too important to be left to technologists alone. And I think that sort of this sense of confidence building, this sense of idea that we can all have a say, that this is our data, this should be the first thing that we're teaching people through any sort of educational system. Just sort of this awareness that technology isn't just about what's happening in the Facebook offices. Technology is our data, our information, even our democratic infrastructure, right? Like a small change in Facebook's algorithms could theoretically have the power to swing an election. Even sort of if you look at Twitter's decision on how they are treating Donald Trump's tweets right now, whereby they aren't fully deleting them, but the ones in which Donald Trump is inciting violence, they're essentially covering it with a little warning and explaining why they are keeping them on. Tech is just about social infrastructure. And I think that one of the most important things that we should be doing in our education system right now is essentially telling people, listen, this is not about, CEOs in really nice hoodies sitting in air-conditioned offices. This is not about programmers who are earning huge amounts of money. This is about you, and you have every right to be asking questions and demanding answers about this.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And a couple of thoughts that came to my mind while you were answering are that maybe I would like to have your opinion. All that happened about the COVID apps was an occasion to raise awareness on, the consequences of the sharing of our personal data. Because I think I never saw before a so broad discussion on how to implement the idea of a contact tracing app, and people really, I would say, not usually interested in such topics, discussing on centralized or decentralized system and all these maybe buzz about the app. I don't know. I think that maybe was an occasion to raise a little bit the general awareness, and I'd like to have your thought on this. And another question that came to my mind was when you spoke about the behaviors of social networks on deciding what to publish, what to promote, to push with their algorithm, and that that happens maybe mostly in Italy, but we are very still used to use all the categories like our social network user editors so they are responsible of what they publish, or they are simply a technology infrastructure. So, I mean, maybe it's time to go beyond such an old way of seeing the world. What do you think?
No, okay, so you've given me two super fun questions. I don't know which I should look into, if I should look into both. I mean, I think that so contact tracing is something really, really interesting, because contact tracing, okay, so first of all, like in medical research in general, the idea of contact tracing already exists. So I was at this webinar by the British government and the National Health Service of the US, of the UK, which gathered a couple of people to talk about contact tracing, including like medical and privacy professionals. And they were saying, listen, in the past, if you had like an infectious disease, you would still have like a team of people who were trying to track down everyone you were in contact with. Contact tracing is not new. The only really, really new thing about it is sort of Bluetooth contact tracing. And I think that one of the really important things here is that we need to find a way of talking about Bluetooth contact tracing without sort of giving citizens the idea that this is too complicated for you to understand. As in, we need to find really, really good ways of explaining contact tracing and its shortcomings in a very, very simple way. I think that's sort of one of the issues with technology in general, and I feel this as well. Like, you know, sometimes when I try to explain technology to someone and the face lights up and it's like, wow, this is magic, it feels like this really, really powerful moment to me. Like, I have this power, I have this ability to explain something, and through this ability, I almost become like a magician. But the problem is that this is very, very harmful for public understanding of technology, because there's still this idea that sort of technology is something that happens for technologists, or that happens to technologists alone. And I think one of the most important things we need to do with contact tracing is actually explain to people how this works, and not say we are using Bluetooth magic, but actually explain to people, your phone is sending out this signal traces other phones, and then if somebody reports in the system, that essentially give people a very, very sort of straightforward explanation. Because if people don't understand your system, they will have to trust whoever created your system. And most people probably don't have, in a lot of countries, they don't have enough trust for the government to just think, okay, the government said the system's okay, therefore I should install it on my phone. Not only this, but like a lot of the government contact tracing systems, like I believe Qatar's, have been I need to double check if it was Qatar or some other countries that was compulsory install. It was compulsory to install. At the same time, the program was very, very badly designed. So whenever like you want to have any sort of good and productive communication with citizens about technology, you really, really need to have a discussion in which you explain the technology, explain what it can do, what it cannot do, its shortcomings and the like. Essentially, it's very, very lazy to substitute the word technology when instead you're trying to talk about magic. I think that this is something that tech companies have loved to talk about, because this adds sort of, you know, this feeling of mystery. And it's very, very good for user growth. It's very good for user growth if sort of, you know, you type in a query into a Google search box and you feel like it's the Google magic pixies and the Google magic elves just delivering stuff to you. It's something that's really, really nice for user to feel. But when we are starting to no longer use technology as a tool or something for entertainment, but actually like as the backbone of our civic infrastructure, when political advertising appears on Facebook, when, for example, decisions about what content stays up on social media and what content is taken down, when you're using contact tracing on a mass scale, the technology as magic explanation no longer really works, and people stop being impressed with technology as magic. Instead, they start to fear technology as magic. So there's this wonderful quote I saw by a former Twitter executive who was just being dropped off by a rideshare driver, like I believe it was for Lyft, which is a bit like Uber, but mostly focused to the US. And the driver just told him something like, "Today has been a good day. I've been blessed by the algorithm." And that was such an interesting quote, because, you know, for the driver, this algorithm wasn't something that he or she was shaping or influencing. It wasn't something that they had a say in. Instead, sort of the algorithm was something that would happen to the driver, and based on the algorithm and the whims of the algorithm, the driver would have a great day or a bad day. And I think that a lot of us sort of feel pushed around or controlled by technology. And this is really, really bad, because it also means that we don't, for example, see that we can take security practices into our own hands. And we can actually take steps to become more secure, to store our passwords, to watch out what we share, because it feels like, the whole experience between humans and digital technology has felt like this very, very alienating. We know better than you. Our algorithms are magic. Sit back and click this, which becomes really, really problematic once issues like Facebook content moderation and the like appear. And then you also asked me about whether social networks should be editors, yes?
Yes, I did, but feel free to skip
no.
it's not
this is like
interesting for you.
This is like, this is a discussion that will never ever be fully solved. But I mean, let's put it that way. Everybody generates such incredible amounts of content that displaying content chronologically on Facebook would no longer work, right? Like, let's, for example, say that I took 20 photos of a house plant in my room, and I uploaded all 20 photos on Facebook, then you probably wouldn't want to see 20 photos of my houseplant, right? Like, you'd probably want to scroll through other things than photos of my houseplant. You'd probably want to scroll through things like your holiday photos or your friends' photos, or where your friends have been going out, or your friends' skiing pictures, whatever. So because of this, Facebook has to discriminate, because there's just too much content for chronological ranking to work anymore. You can no longer see all of the content from your friends, just because there's too much content for you to realistically show. So therefore, sort of the algorithmic discrimination, or like sort of the algorithmic picking of content, is inevitable unless you'd like to spend hours upon hours every day scrolling through everything that's been generated or liked by your friends. So the editorial function, to a certain degree, it's inevitable. Now, I think that one of the things that technologists often take if everything looks like if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail approach. And I think that if we looked at Facebook's attempts to do a lot of things regarding content moderation or editing in the past, you can tell that Facebook is a media company, or they're public democratic infrastructure or whatever, but they're still trying to very much dress up as a tech company. So Facebook's attitude towards almost everything has been to put algorithms above human judgment. When there were issues with hate speech, bam, the result was, let's do more algorithms. When the issues were, for example, with extremist content, similarly, the answer was very, very much algorithms, and means that Facebook as an institution is very, very much culturally sort of inclined to code its way, to essentially code its way, or creating like a machine learning algorithm to code its way out of any problem, rather than sort of face difficult human judgment. And I think that this is the issue. That essentially, Facebook is no longer a tech company. Facebook is a media company. Facebook is democratic infrastructure. Facebook, you can't really win an election in a lot of places now unless you're on Facebook. But Facebook is still full of coders who would love to just keep on coding. And I think that this is sort of the big paradox. And this is one of the reasons why we have such huge issues with them. Because Facebook is very often feels arrogant in that they can code their way out of any problem, but they also just aren't culturally suited as an institution for any other engagement with the world.
Yeah, I think that from this dichotomy starts a lot of troubles in understanding what Facebook is accountable for, should or shouldn't be doing. Okay, let's get back on track with our previously agreed list of questions. Now, I was interested, and I mean, all the questions are somehow intertwined. In one of your newsletters, because Łukasz has a personal newsletter, which is quite interesting, and in one of your newsletters, you state that security is a subjective matter. I was very curious about this concept. Can you explain a bit what you mean?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So I've been very lucky to be doing a tiny bit of security training in the past and sort of train journalists and NGOs and some others in security. And the thing is that you can't really there isn't a one size fits all security plan, because whenever you start talking about security, you talk about something called a threat model. And what could be a huge threat to me might not be a huge threat to you, and vice versa. So, for example, for some people, it might be very, very uncomfortable if, let's say, their home address was leaked, or if their photos of the holidays were leaked. For somebody else, this might not be a big deal at all. And, they might be inviting so many people for house parties over the house that half of the town knows where they live anyway. So different people have very, very different limits when it comes to the comfort of what they want to reveal about themselves, what they don't want to reveal. And a security breach could be minor for one person, but catastrophic for another person. So whenever sort of you think about security plans, it's not that I can instantly tell you, use this, this, and this. Instead, before we recommend any tools, we really need to sort of sit down and think about what it actually means to be using the tools. So Signal, for example, is an encrypted messenger, which is considered probably the gold standard in many places for security and encryption. But Signal, for example, requires that you use a phone number to register. So this means that for a lot of people, they live in countries where, for example, you need to register your phone number with the government. So the government would instantly know that you have a Signal account, and they could probably, try to catfish you on Signal. They could probably do lots and lots of different things to you on Signal, or even know that you're on the system based on the fact that you have a phone number. For many other people, they live in situations where you can buy a SIM card anonymously from any kiosk, and therefore it's no problem whatsoever. So essentially, everybody's sort of threat level is very, very different. And before we jump into tools or organization procedures, we really sort of need to understand, what are you afraid of? And what sort of situation would be difficult for you? What sort of situation would be weird for you? What sort of situation would be catastrophic for you? And this is a weird mix that both sort of, for some situations are very much about psychological security. So very often when governments, for example, try to break into activists, they will try to, I don't know, leak messages or leak details about their private lives. For some people, this would be very, very difficult. For some people, this would not be as big of an issue. So before we jump into security, the first thing you need to sort of figure out is what are you afraid of, and what are the main points that you try to protect. So that's why security is so subjective, because it's not that we can tell everybody to use this and this tool. Instead, we really need to start getting people to think about what is their actual scenario. So this whole process is known as threat modeling. There are some wonderful articles about threat modeling. One of them, I think, is called How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love My Threat Model. And this one actually, I believe, includes pictures of like a chart that looks at what Batman's threat model could be like. And then the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, has also done a very good introduction to threat modeling as well. So I would definitely recommend taking a look at things like this and sort of, think about what are your points of vulnerability and what are you afraid of. And only once you know what you are afraid of or what could be the biggest threat to you, that's when you should jump in and think about which security tools to use.
Yeah, maybe this answer already another question I'd like to ask you about. The urge to share and the necessity to protect your privacy. Apps and platforms always are meant to push people to share, to be connected somehow. But once you begin to use them, you are already, your threat model starts to become an important issue. So how do you think, maybe you already answered, but I don't know if you have something to add about how can we cope with this two diverging necessities or issues?
No. That's a really, really good question, in fact. And once again, it very, very much depends on people and how comfortable they are, for example, with adopting a public persona, right? So sometimes there are people who will, for example, prefer to use pseudonyms when lecturing or use pseudonyms when doing research because they don't want to tie things to a public persona at all, then there are people who will, even security researchers, who will happily sort of take photos from the holidays and share them on the Twitter accounts. So it really, really depends, once again, on what you consider your threat level to be, what you consider your threat model to be, and what you consider your sort of personal level of threat comfort to be, and can depend on lots of things. It can depend on things like gender, ethnicity, professional level. It can depend on which country you're based in, and it can very, very much depend on which adversary are you trying to face against. So, I mean, if, for example, if Facebook is a threat model for you, if you're worried about being tracked by Facebook, by all means, try to keep as little of your data on Facebook and its associated programs like platforms like Instagram and WhatsApp. Try to keep as much off of them as possible. If you don't consider Facebook to be a threat model, or if like the idea of Facebook knowing a lot about you is not something, or even Facebook knowing a bit about you is not something that like scares you or makes you very, very uncomfortable, and if you feel okay with sort of sharing your life as a semi-public persona, I think that that's perfectly okay as well. I think that one of the issues, though, is that you need to be aware that if you are living your life as a semi-public persona, and I mean, I think that lots of people are, like, I contain the city I'm based in my Twitter bio, and I can easily, like, you know, share pictures of my travels, and when I'm at conferences, I will happily sort of talk to people about the places I've been at, right? But this also means that I need to figure out, and I need to think about, how do people get this information about me? So, for example, if let's say there are photos of me at a conference on Facebook, or like photos of me speaking or participating in a conference on Facebook, then I need to know that if someone approaches me like 2 years later and tells me, listen, we met at this conference, want to grab a coffee? It doesn't necessarily mean that we met at this conference. It just means that this person has information that I was at this conference. And it's quite easy to figure out that they had this information because they could just look it up and look me up on a platform like Facebook or Twitter. If, on the other hand, I was doing much more advanced identity management or trying to keep all my photos off of such platforms and the like, then it will be much, much more interesting to figure out, how does this person know this? And the chances, let's say, that they got it just for browsing the conference website will be much, much lower. So I think that whenever we share public data about ourselves, we also need to be ready, especially if we're working, you know, on a higher level as like journalists, human rights activists, maybe in NGOs, maybe in some government roles, that people can use a lot of data around us. They could maybe use it for phishing scams. They could maybe use it to, you know, impersonate us or something. I think that for 80+% of people and 90+% of people living in sort of, especially those living in places that could be considered stable democracies, for most of them, it's perfectly okay to have a public or semi-public persona. But just be aware that then people will know much more about you. And it might mean that if someone, for example, approaches you and claims to know you or claims to have seen you at the conference, it might be worth to just be a little more cautious about that.
Yeah, great. And actually, these were mechanisms that were in place also before technology was so pervasive, but now there is much more information about anybody, and it's much easier to find. So the game changes a bit. Before going on, I would like to remember all the participants that if they have questions to,
yes, please,
for Łukasz, they can just type them in the chat of our
or just use the microphone and speak out, I guess.
Oh yeah, we can try also. Why not? Okay, I will. We are a bit running out of time, but if you have time, I would like to have a little last corner about the GDPR.
No.
Yeah, but I mean, I like to talk about the way you talk about consent. So when we browse the internet, we are always asked to consent to cookies, which is quite a critical way to manage consent, I will say, because actually we could, in theory, opt out from any single data broker, but I mean, it could be a very painful and time-consuming activity. So basically, no one does it. So do you think it's okay and it's GDPR friendly to ask people to opt out from dozens of data brokers, or should it be an issue that DPAs should start to address with their fines?
Okay, so I don't want to comment too much about the cookie consent laws because I think that a lot of digital ink has been spilled on them. I think that the first thing that I will say is that, first of all, the more private you are, the more you stand out as well, right? If you, for example, enable a VPN and you only log in for a VPN's IP address, and if you disable all cookies and maybe disable all JavaScript and do a lot of those privacy measures, you are, let's say, being flagged up as one of the only 10,000 or 100,000 people in the EU who takes extreme privacy measures. And this in itself is already a bit of a red flag for some people. And not only this, but it also breaks a lot of the web. Like when I would, for example, install a VPN or install more aggressive cookie blocking measures, every sort of half of the website I'd visit would have the please prove that you're not a robot by identifying, the cars and feeding into Google's traffic light recognition system so that Google can do traffic lights at some point, right? So Google can do self-driving cars. So the moment I tried to run an experiment and implement a lot of those privacy enhancing tools, what starts happening is that after a while, when you start blocking all tracking, then you get a lot of the Google security warnings, you get a lot of the anti-spam warnings, because a lot of the web also uses tracking as a way of making sure that you're not a bot or making sure that you're not a security threat, because a lot of the automated security threats also don't use any of the tracking software or aren't in any of the tracking databases. So first of all, being very anonymous on the web nowadays is also a very, very impractical endeavor, right? The second problem, I think, is that even if you were to disable cookies, there are other ways of tracking you. One of the most common ones is for so-called browser fingerprinting. So browser fingerprinting is, you can use things like how big your browser window is, what screen resolution you have, what browser extensions you have installed, which browser version you're using, which operating system version you're using, which fonts you have installed. And all of those details are details requested by websites, in part to give you a pretty good browser experience, right? So for example, if you're working on Jitsi Meet, and I haven't tried this, but if, for example, I try to log in with Internet Explorer 6, Jitsi would be bah, you need to have something that's not Internet Explorer 6 in order for the app to be supported. And the more complex and rich web apps get, the more data about us they also require. So I think that there's very, very innocuous reasons for why sort of websites get so much information about who we are as a browser and who we are as a user. But a huge amount of this information can also be used to track us. There's this website called Panopticlick, like a wordplay on the word panopticon, just Panopticlick.
Yeah.
It's run by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a very reputable NGO. And Panopticlick sort of shows you exactly what, Panopticlick shows you exactly how unique your browser is. So the very fingerprint of your browser can be 1 in a million or 1 in 4 million. And most people have a browser that's sort of, you can be identified as having a unique computer just by the configuration of your browser. And not just this, if you try to hide this, and if you try to, for example, reduce the amount of information your browser leaks, then you get a lot of the please prove you are not a robot warnings, and a huge amount of the web becomes unusable for you. So I think that one of the interesting things that cookies are not the only way of tracking you. And one of the things that I kind of think is that sometimes it feels like the cookie law makes us think like cookies are the only things tracking us, whereas there's much, much more. The cookie laws, they are, they were a really interesting thing at the start. I like how much I think that they really helped to build awareness. But now what might be much, much better would be, for example, if every website actually had to have a disclaimer on this is how we collect your data, or this is how we track you. And I know that all websites have privacy policies, but let's face it, like privacy policies are absolutely unreadable, right? So if we, for example, had something like a traffic light system or something like this, if we, for example, had, like a 10 item checklist and like a rating that each site had to agree to, this might be much, much more human readable. Because come on, like, when's the last time most of us have read a privacy policy? I see I've got a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Whether or not I'm afraid I have no idea whether cookies as a data collection method are consistent with GDPR. Like, most of my work is about digital security rather than privacy. So there's unfortunately very, very little I know about the legal nuances of the GDPR. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. It's that maybe I should have told you that panel fit is very focused on law. So people who is interested in what we do is has this kind of background. So it's yeah. But yeah, that's okay. Thank you, Jose. Anyway, for the question. Well, okay. I guess we are okay. We have another question. Jose, do you
I'm just reading
to...
it. Would you say that the GDPR idea of freedom of consent is consistent with other fields of law? From my point of view, this is non-responsible consent more than free consent. Ooh, I mean, so this is really, really interesting about this is really, really interesting. Once again, I am not a lawyer, so I'm not that familiar with the idea of by which I mean I'm not at all familiar with the ideas of non-responsible consent and free consent, but I would probably say that consent on the internet is almost impossible nowadays. I would say that very often and it's always been like this in a lot of IT related topics, where if we, for example, looked at the licensing or end user license agreements of software like Microsoft Windows or Apple's macOS, honestly, the only one that was vaguely human readable and understandable were always the open source licenses. And that's because they were designed to be such, right? So I think that from the very beginning, I don't think that the end user license agreements were in any way meant to be human readable. And I think that technology law, unfortunately, has this long and difficult history of never being fully human readable. And I think that online this becomes even more difficult, because you don't actually see how your data would travel. So Jose, you'd like to raise your hand, yeah?
Yeah, let's open the mic.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It's been really interesting, and
thank you.
Working with these issues, it's more encouraging to keep on. My question was, one of the topics that I'm working with is consent, and GDPR defines the freedom of consent as any consent for the data processing is free if no bad consequences are associated with the withdrawal of this consent. So I like to compare this situation with another typical and very common situation of buying a newspaper on the street, and I pay with my euro coin, and then I want to withdraw this consent, but I keep my newspaper, but I want to take back my euro because I just I changed my opinion on that. This is not freedom of consent. This is non-responsible consent. So because the freedom is associated also with responsibility. If I want to withdraw my consent, I have to face the consequences. And this is something that the GDPR does not regulate. So I think this is a source of very important problems if we want to coordinate data protection, personal data protection, and economy of data. So data processing and data as as a source of wealth and material for the AI system.
Sorry, Jose, could you please introduce yourself before?
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
Antonio Castillo from from Bilbao, from the research group of law and human genome.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry.
No, okay, so thank you for your question. So it's really, really interesting. I think that one of the things is that it's impossible for us to really get a huge amount of information about how our data is moved and processed. So it's a bit like, it's a bit like if I give my advertiser data to Facebook, maybe my profile will get anonymized. Or for example, let's say that, for example, based on my data, Facebook then decides that like 1001 people viewed this ad rather than 1000. This data then goes into a completely different type of analytics, which goes into a completely different type of analytics, where this data then, because let's say it's not just 1001 people, but out of those 1001 people, 15 people are interested in, let's say, hiking or running. This data is not fully anonymized, even though it tries to be. And because this data is being moved around and interpreted and reinterpreted in such different ways, I would say that it's impossible for any user to understand, and therefore consent is kind of impossible.
Łukasz, can't hear you anymore?
Yeah, sorry, it said that I've been muted by a fellow Jitser.
Oh, sorry.
Now I've been unmuted.
Okay.
Perfect. No, so this is, I think, that the first thing that I would say that, even ideas of consent are super complicated. So they're really, really difficult to unravel. And I would say that's impossible to understand. I think that the second thing is that even if we do not consent, our experience of browsing the web will inevitably be degraded, right? So if you, for example, don't accept any cookies and don't tell your browser not to send out any tracking information and use a VPN or use Tor and give no data about yourself, then essentially your browsing experience will be very, very much degraded, to the degree that almost every page, like before every Google search, you will need to, do those "Are you a robot?" challenges. Essentially, you will not be able to use the web half as efficiently as you would be able to use otherwise. So I think that it's not that there are consequences, even if companies could say that they are theoretically treating you similarly, because so many of their anti-spam and security mechanisms are tied up with tracking and privacy related information. So the more information they have about you, the less they see you as a security threat. So if they need to ascertain whether or not you're a security threat, when they need to give you all of those "you're not a robot" tests, or maybe slow down or test your connection or do any of another series of things, then of course your quality will be very, very much degraded as well. So I think that it is a really, really complicated issue, because as much as in theory, like our refusal to give data should not affect whether or not we can do a Google search, as much as we should theoretically be able to do a search without being able to track for data, or even as much as we can, for example, opt out of targeted advertising. If we opt out of targeted advertising, it can be much more difficult for the companies to, for example, see that we're not a spammer, or that we're not a botnet, or that we're not a DDoS attack. Like a distributed denial of service attack. So like a way to flood the server and overwhelm it. So because if companies cannot track us, they see us as a potential security threat, and it's up to us to prove that we're not a security threat. Because of this, like our experience will be significantly degraded if we refuse to consent in such ways. Did that I know that this didn't fully explain your question. I hope that helped a bit.
Yeah, to me it was very clear.
Okay.
I don't know the rest of the audience, but I would say that we went far beyond our half an hour limit.
Yeah.
So
listen, thank you so much for everybody. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Federico, first of all, for having me over. Thanks everybody for being here and for being a wonderful, supportive crowd. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for giving me the platform and the time. And I hope that this was a fun and rewarding experience for you. And if like, you can always find me on Twitter and other platforms as well. So if you've got any questions, you can always reach out.